leave the stage to Kevlin Henney.
Right. Good morning. This is a question that we often ask. We just had a talk that was very much, the dominant aspect of the talk was about communication, and I don't intend to change that. The opening talk of the day was very much about thinking. I don't intend to change that theme. In fact, I'm going to weave both of those things together. What do you mean? This is a question that we are often challenged with. In fact, to be honest, this is the one we're actually challenged with. And meaning is difficult, meaning is slippery, but meaning is our business. One of the things I do for fun, but not for profit, is I write. I write short fiction. So I'm always interested in how much advice we can carry over from the world of writing to the world of software. And this is from Robert Louis Stevenson in the rather excitingly titled Truth of Intercourse. The word intercourse is a word that has changed meaning with time. So that shift of meaning is already a warning to us that whatever is true at one point is not necessarily true at another. Robert Louis Stevenson is a 19th century Scottish author who gave us such greats as Treasure Island and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And he observes, the difficulty of literature is not to write, but to write what you mean. Not to affect your reader, but to affect him precisely as you wish. This is really interesting because ultimately what we're trying to do, and when we think about it ultimately with software development, and when we start looking at things like the code, ultimately what we are trying to do is place a concept, a model, if you like, of thinking from this head into somebody else's head. However, in the absence of telepathy, it turns out this is non-trivial. Although, that said, I'm sure if the human race suddenly acquired telepathic abilities, civilization would be wiped out in about 5 minutes. Honestly, you don't want to know what other people are thinking. So, Meyer Lehman wrote in this paper from 1980, Programs, Life Cycles, and Laws of Software Evolution, absolutely fascinating paper on many levels. There's this lovely paragraph in there, which I think he had a lot of fun writing. Any program is a model of a model within a theory of a model of an abstraction of some portion of the world or of some universe of discourse. It's just like, that's brilliant. It's true, but it's also fun. What a great way of thinking about this. So this is now the one that you can offer people when they say, so what do you do for a living? Okay, just drop that one in there. So there's this idea of trying to place a model in somebody else's head. This is how I'm thinking about it. And it doesn't mean that I'm right. It's just I want you to know that this is how I'm thinking about it so that you evaluate what I have written and what I'm saying on those terms as opposed to other terms. But there's another word here which is rather interesting, abstraction. Now, abstraction is a word that we use a great deal. The problem is that it's not always obvious what we mean. Sometimes people use the term abstraction to talk about vagueness. As Dijkstra in the ironically titled 1972 Turing Award paper, The Humble Programmer. The reason I say it's ironic is that somebody once observed that ego is measured in nanodijkstras. The Humble Programmer. The purpose of abstraction is not to be vague, but to create a new semantic level in which one can be absolutely precise. This is interesting because we use the term abstraction a great deal in software development. We talk about abstract data types, abstract classes. We talk about the idea of something being more abstract versus concrete. We value skills in abstraction. But when I run workshops, one of the things I ask people is, what do you mean by abstraction or abstract? Very few people are ever able to come up with a good answer. It's a word whose meaning to us is implied but not defined. Abstraction means literally to remove something. We're going to try and remove something in order to... A good abstraction is where we remove the things we don't need in order to focus on the things we do need. A poor abstraction is where we remove things that we do need or where we leave in things that we don't and we have noise. And this allows us to better reason about abstraction. But the problem here is this one of semantics. And he mentions semantics. And you may have been involved in discussions, I know I have, I've probably even said this, where at some point there's a sort of a dismissal, where somebody says, oh, that's just semantics. It's just semantics. Now, I want you to pause next time that happens. Either next time you say it or next time you hear it. What is that person saying? It's just meaning. What else are we doing? There is nothing else. To say it's just semantics is, well, yes, exactly. That's exactly what we're trying to debate. That's exactly what we're trying to establish. That's not a dismissal. That's an acknowledgement. That throws it right into the center of our focus. So this is the interesting thing. When we start looking at software, we look at its structure internally, but also, hopefully, the software plays some role in some organization or in some customer's world. What you're doing is you're creating a system of meaning. Hopefully a system has meaning to the person using it. Hopefully the artifacts, the classes, the components, the very variable names, your choice of indentation, even the smallest detail, has meaning. And this is quite important because I'm going to say, along with, oh, that's just semantics, that's just a detail is another one of those great dismissals. And again, I always say to people, well, what else do you think we're doing in software? That's all software is. It is just details. That's what makes it so hard. It's lots and lots and lots of tiny little details that all have to fit together. That is the nature of the world of software. That's the whole point of it. It is just details. So software is creating a system of meaning on the inside and the outside. This is a non-trivial activity. So this covers, clearly, things like code. But we also need to make sure that we take in enough of the world, because people have this kind of bias. Code, what's that? Let's say I'm a Java programmer. Yeah, it's Saturday. Yeah, bad day. So I'm a Java programmer. Maybe there's more life on Sunday. Who knows? So I think in terms of the code there. I think in terms of the production code. And then there's all this other stuff, but that's not code. Honestly, it is. All of your tests, they're code as well. All of your scripts, they're code as well. In fact, the list keeps on going. All those configuration files, that's code as well. I love it when Java programmers say, oh, you know, we've got no coupling here, you know, we're using dependency injection, and you sit there and go, hang on, what's all that XML? Oh, that's not code. No, really it is. Oh, yeah, it's just how the system fits together. Yeah, it's kind of a big deal. You know, how we put this stuff together is non-trivial. It's also code. It's in codified form. Oh, that's just XML. It's human readable. Is it? What kind of human are you thinking of? So it's all of these. And let's play with the words a little bit. It is code. It is codified knowledge. The activity of software development is an exercise in meaning, but it is also an exercise in knowledge. That is what a code base is. It's a knowledge base. Now, it's quite interesting when you look at a code base from that perspective. It causes you to reevaluate what you're doing. That means that software development is an activity, a team activity, a collaborative activity of trying to establish a knowledge base. Any software system is effectively an executable Wikipedia. Here is our understanding of the world of the customer's domain. Here is our understanding of the technology that we are using and the choices that we have made. That's what it is. It is a codification of your knowledge. Now, sometimes when I tell this to people, they get a little bit unsettled because they say, oh, okay, that's a shame. Clearly our knowledge is a mess. Because what you've got is, this is what I thought, this is what we thought this week, this is what somebody who thought 6 months ago, this is what somebody I've never met thought 6 years ago, and we've got this arbitrary set, and the system is at war with itself. So this tells us that software development as an activity is a process of knowledge acquisition. You're acquiring knowledge. It also means that you are always working with incomplete knowledge. This is one of the most important ideas, that by definition you are working with incomplete knowledge. Now sometimes that sounds a little bit scary, except for the fact that you did it this morning. In fact, humans are really good at this. We always work with incomplete knowledge. The problem comes when we think that we have complete knowledge and we give ourselves that illusion. That's the danger. It's when if we acknowledge, yeah, we don't know everything, but that's okay. We can figure out. I can't tell you the answer now, but I can figure out an answer collectively within 3 months, and the answer may be different in another 6 months, and so on. So therefore, when you are asked by your higher up, or higher ups, the plural is ambiguous on that one, when you're asked, by a higher up. There you go, I've solved the problem. What is it that you learnt at Beauty and Code? You said, I learnt that our software development process is a process of knowledge acquisition, and we should structure this with respect to the codification of artifacts and models and abstractions. That sounds great. Put it on a slide, put it in an email. The rest of us are just going to call it learning. Okay? Learning is a lovely little word because it sounds so simple, and yet it is so hard. But what it tells us is that you are working with incomplete knowledge and that you may change your mind about a thing that you previously thought you understood. And how, if we're going to acquire knowledge, it's no use keeping it to ourselves. We communicate it, which also tells us that the very act of software development is an act of social negotiation. This means that when people are talking about coding guidelines, they're not talking about absolute truths, they're talking about a social negotiation. Your coding styles, your choices are often an aspect of social negotiation, compromise. Which tells us, interestingly, that what we're dealing with when you're dealing with a code base is the code base is not just a codification of knowledge, it is a model of participation. Model of participation, that sounds pretty cool. We already have a phrase for that. It's called software architecture. An architecture is a model of participation. It's a model of how people will work and live and where they go and where they do not go. That's what architecture is. That's the real world metaphor, but it also applies in code. In software, we are saying that how people get together and communicate and cooperate is an aspect of participation. It's an aspect of architecture. And it's this establishment of meaning. So all of this comes down to this idea of design. We are creating something on purpose. We're trying to create a structure intentionally, but we're not exactly sure what we're trying to create and why. But when we talk about design, there are two aspects. There are two aspects to design. One is synthesis, the act of bringing something together. The other is analysis, the act of taking something apart. And historically, we have had this habit of taking a very reductionist and linear view of things. First of all, we try and understand something through analysis, and then we put together a design. We synthesize the things. We often talk about decomposition. But what about composition? But we think of these in a linear progression with respect to time. I think that both of these are essential, but what we have been learning is that a software system is living. How do living things work? Well, it turns out the way to think about the relationship between analysis and synthesis is like this. Systole. The systole is the contraction of the heart that pushes blood into your system. Diastole is the relaxation of the muscles that allows the chambers of your heart to fill. It turns out that we do this quite a lot. Okay? You don't just do it once. We've analyzed everything, now we're going to synthesize everything. You don't have one huge, great moment of systole when you are born, and then the rest of your life is diastole. This happens around 2 billion times. Okay? Just as a point of reference, most living creatures that have a heart system have, it's generally complex life forms. It's around 1 billion heartbeats to a lifetime, approximately. I'm not quite sure why that number is useful, but one day you will thank me when that comes up as a question. You can say, yeah, about 1 billion. So this also tells us if the natural flow of design and creation and discovery is not an ordered progression, but a cyclic progression, it also tells us, as Ernest Hemingway observed, the only kind of writing is rewriting. This is what you're doing when you are creating software. And yet the point is that we've often taken the act of writing a piece of code as a commitment. It is no more a commitment than just a commitment to a moment. This is currently what I'm thinking. I know no better. But you know what? Next week I might know more. And that's okay. The trick is to say, that's okay, and I will come back to it. We often don't do that. We have lots of phrases for what happens. Yeah? Technical debt being one of the more popular ones. A mess is another one. Code entropy, there's lots of terminology here. But it tells us this idea that if we are to consider, we are living and breathing, therefore the things we create should also reflect this idea. And we will not have perfect knowledge. Now, there's a book here, Robert McKee. It's on screenwriting. There's some interesting stuff in this book. It's a little formulaic in places, but there's some real insights here. On story, there's this lovely observation where he says, if a plot works out exactly as you first planned, you're not working loosely enough, okay, to give room to your imagination and instincts. I think this is interesting and provocative, because what we're saying here is if everything worked out as planned, there's a little bit of disappointment. Because what, you learned nothing? There was no new knowledge. We've made no discoveries. We did not discover something that says, oh, that's interesting. We could do something with that, either from a programmatic perspective or with respect to the market. Being able to say, oh yeah, we never thought about that, but now I've done this, I've got a new idea, and that takes me in a different direction. There's a really interesting idea here. And this is the idea that having a plot is a really good idea, because if you don't have an idea, then it's difficult to change your ideas. Yeah? So therefore, have something, and your goal there is, this is my current understanding, but that may change. It's a function of time, and that's okay, and that it may get better. In fact, one of the things that I have is I have an interest in words and language, and I run a page on Facebook, Word Friday. Every now and then on a Friday, I will post an unusual word definition. And the rest of the week, I just post articles about language and linguistics and things. But one of the interesting words that I posted a while back comes from the writing community and reflects exactly what Robert McKee was saying. Pantser. What is a pantser? A writer who writes by the seat of their pants. This was captured brilliantly in a quote from the author Louis L'Amour. He said one day his daughter came up to him, and he's on a typewriter. For those of you who are too young to remember what typewriters are, they're kind of like a PC connected to a printer, but without all that kind of CPU and screen nonsense. Yeah. And she said, "Daddy, why are you writing so fast?" And he said, "Because I want to find out what happens." And there's a great deal of truth to that. And this is a term used in the creative writing community. It's in contrast to a plotter. A plotter has everything worked out, a very strict outline. Now, in truth, many writers are somewhere in between. Sometimes some stories come out because they're pantsed, sometimes they come out because they are plotted, sometimes an author will choose to plot something just to get it settled in their mind, but as they create it, that goes away. It's just like, right, we throw that away. That got me settled. That was my mental first model, but I'm happy to discard that as new ideas come along. And so it is with software. What we're dealing with here is this exercise of language. Now, when we use the word language in the world of software, our default assumption is that we're talking about a programming language. The awkward bit we don't want to acknowledge is the fact that a lot of stuff deals with natural language, which is way, way messier. It's a lot sloppier. And natural language is, for all of its strengths, for all of its color, for all of its variety, there's some problems here, and we need to be very careful with what we assume about language. So I edited this book a few years ago, 97 Things Every Programmer Should Know, and there's a number of items contributed, one of them from Keith Braithwaite, Read the Humanities. And he makes a really good observation. Ludwig Wittgenstein makes a very good case that any language we use to speak to one another is not and cannot be a serialization format for getting a thought or idea or picture out of one person's head and into another's. There is this idea that sometimes people hold that language is the perfect medium for doing this. It isn't. It's part of our way of communicating, but it tends not to be everything. You think in a very concurrent fashion, yet we speak in a very serialized fashion. You think in a chaotic fashion, and yet we speak, hopefully, in an ordered fashion. And we edit ourselves. Yeah? The act of speaking requires a different kind of thinking. Sometimes that is useful, but sometimes it can hold us back. It's a channel, and sometimes channeling excludes the other things we want to say. It means we focus on something, which is a good thing, but this is human focus. Focus is interesting because by definition, if you are focused on one thing, by definition, you are not focused on something else. That is the definition of focus. So it's wonderful if you're in the zone and you are explaining something, but it means there's something that is probably being forgotten. If you acknowledge that that might be the case, that's great. If you think that you have told the whole truth, that's where the problems start. That becomes an illusion that comes to dominate your development. Wittgenstein also shows that our ability to understand one another at all does not arise from shared definitions. It arises from a shared experience, from a form of life. That's really important. I may read things and I may be given an insight into somebody else's life, either how they live in a different part of the world, in a different culture, in a different time, or their world, the world of their business. But that's not the same as actually living it. This may be one of the reasons why programmers who are steeped in their problem domain tend to do better than those who stand apart from it. We often overdo the idea of separations. These separations can offer us perspective, but sometimes they actually distance us from the thing that we're interested in. So what we've got to do is mind the gap. So another one from 97 Things, from Nate Jackson. I love this piece because it's one of those titles that tells you exactly what the piece is about. There's no ambiguity here. Your customers do not mean what they say. That's really important because we often say, oh, you've got to go to your customers and they'll tell you what they mean. No, they won't. This is a cooperative detective exercise. It's an exercise in archaeology, detective work, and all kinds of other things. I've never met a customer yet that wasn't all too happy to tell me what they wanted, usually in great detail. The problem is that customers don't always tell you the whole truth. They generally don't lie. This is the important thing. When somebody's not telling you the truth, it doesn't mean that they're lying. They are telling you what they believe about the truth. They are telling you the current channel that they're focused on. They're giving you a point of view, which is valuable, but it may not be the only game in town. They use their terms in their context. They leave out significant details. Omission, that is one of the most exciting things when we come to talk about meaning. It's not what is said sometimes, it's what is not said. And they make assumptions. I think one of the most interesting things, that I often do this one in workshops, is I ask people, how do you know you have an assumption? This is a kind of an interesting question because occasionally I come across projects that have a sort of a document or a page that says project assumptions. And it always makes me chuckle because there's a problem with that. You only know you have an assumption after the fact. It's a contradiction. You discover it because it becomes contradicted. You say, oh, I had assumed that. Now, guess what? You've just discovered something because it was contradicted. To be able to say in advance, here are all of our assumptions, is an impressive feat, which is actually philosophically impossible. Okay? But that doesn't stop some people doing it. The best you can ever do is known assumptions so far, ... Make it exciting, to be continued. That's the whole thing. We can catalog our discovered assumptions. And that's one of our acts. We should talk about exploring this. And Dan has a term for this, deliberate discovery. This is part of that universe. You're going to set out with the understanding that you don't know all of these. But that's okay. We're going to find them out. And we're going to use different techniques to kind of kick the domain in one way or another, subtly change our viewpoints, change other people's viewpoints, and see what we reveal. So this is compounded by the fact that many customers don't actually know what they want in the first place. Now, occasionally I hear developers going, oh, the customer doesn't know what they want. I have some very bad news for you. It turns out that this paragraph generalizes. It turns out that this is not a property of customers, this is a property of human beings. And yes, I'm going to further astound you this very Saturday by pointing out that software developers are human beings. I know, it's one of the great discoveries of the 21st century. Cognitively, it turns out that we share all the weaknesses that we have accused others of. It turns out we've got them as well. All those cognitive biases that we say, oh, other people have those, I've seen that. We have them. Lots of them. Oh, it's okay, I work with logic every day. No, you don't. You just think you do. It's very sweet. Every time you put a double ampersand down, you think, I'm being logical. Oh, my goodness, no, that's a moment against the sea of irrationality that we inhabit. So this tells us that if we want to learn stuff, you actually have to finish things. Yeah, Neil Gaiman observes you have to finish things. That's what you learn from. You learn by finishing things. This is why structures of time that assume that we're going to revisit things, that assume that a single pass is not enough, that assume the heartbeat of development, these are more successful. Now, sometimes people say, oh, yes, but in the 1960s, we were told to do software engineering, and software engineering is all about a plan-driven approach. Yeah, this is a classic paper. I did a talk last year that was strongly influenced by this. I was imaginative enough in calling my talk last year 1968. But it's a reminder that actually this is not what people were saying. If you look in this document, it says the design process is an iterative one. It says it in many different places from many different people. In other words, there was an acknowledgement there. You can't just do this once and hope you're going to get it right. You've got to do it many times. So we have to acknowledge that. Now, there was a lot of stuff going on in the 1960s. People were dropping all kinds of things, bombs, acid, all kinds of things. But there was other thinking. This is a very influential book. I didn't realize how influential it was. I read this in the 1990s, but it was only when I started looking back to the 1960s, realizing that this was a very interdisciplinary book. This is Christopher Alexander, Notes on the Synthesis of Form. He does a glorious cover. This is my copy. It's just like, yeah, people don't produce books like that anymore. He's the guy responsible for patents, but in 1964 published this book. And he made an observation here, Notes on the Synthesis of Form. He's not just talking about architecture, building architecture. He's talking about structures of any kind, anything that is created. How do we put these together? And how can we do so successfully? And he talked about a very simple idea. We may therefore picture the process of form making as the action of a series of subsystems, all interlinked yet sufficiently free of one another to adjust independently in a feasible amount of time. This is actually the structure of living organisms as well. It is not a rigid hierarchy. There's a looseness to it. This is subsystems, this is microservices, this is whatever. The idea here is you are decomposing something and you can change it whilst it still has relationships to another part of the system that may remain stable. This is this kind of like, it allows for adjustment. It allows for imperfection. It allows for refinement of knowledge. It allows for rediscovery. It allows for changing of meaning. It works because the cycles of correction, again, cycle. Correction and recorrection, which occur during adaptation, are restricted to one subsystem at a time. They are isolated in this sense. It's represented it like this idea that we can have things that are close and yet things that are also far apart. Put things close together that naturally bind together, but things we are not sure of that may change, that we are uncertain of. Don't couple too strongly to those. Give them a little space to breathe and change, because you're going to discover things. And this is important because sometimes we end up with accidental coupling. We need to observe this. And coupling becomes a problem, because when you start coupling to something, unless you actually need it, then it becomes permanent and you are unable to change the meaning. You're unable to change the system, and eventually that itself becomes part of the system. This is one of those kind of observations. First Roman programmer, months 7, 8, 9, 10 don't have names. What shall we call them? Second Roman programmer, just number them. First Roman programmer, wait a minute, isn't it bad practice to hard code numbers? Second Roman programmer, it's fine, they'll never change. Right, September, October, November, December it is then. If you've ever wondered about the month names, there you go. Month 12 is month 10. Month 11 is month 9. Month 10 is month, wait, what? I remember explaining this to my kids and it's just like, you are kidding. You made this up, Dad. No, not me, somebody else 2,000 years ago. And then somebody moved the baseline. Yeah, it's just like, oops. Yeah, because this will never change. Be careful that your temporary solutions are indeed temporary solutions. How do you make a solution temporary? Well, it first of all has to be acknowledged as that, and you have a recall mechanism. You have a way of revising it. It's no good just labeling it temporary. That doesn't make it temporary. Okay? My oldest son is looking at universities at the moment. One of the universities he's looking at is Newcastle in the north of England. Let's just decompose that for a moment. Newcastle. That castle has not been new for centuries. Okay, but we're still stuck with the label. What should we call this place? I don't know, it looks like a new castle. Cool, right, Newcastle. Yeah, I live in Bristol, across the bridge from Newport in Wales. Again, not new. Temporary designations are only temporary if we have a mechanism for retirement, a mechanism for life. Life mostly involves not just living, but things retire, things die. The cells you have now are not the cells you were born with. So, another use of the word languages, pattern languages, often overlooked, but I want to focus on something slightly different here. Let's talk about meaning. In its earliest form, we talked about semiotics in the book. Semiology defines a sign as a two-part whole, a dyad comprising a signifier and a signified. Signifier is the expression of a sign, its material aspect. The signified is the corresponding mental concept engendered by the signifier. Now, this is what tells us about the pitfalls of language, both in code and in spoken word. Let me give you one here. Here's a word, dinner. It turns out, so this is the signifier, dinner. It's an English word. It originates from a French word. But what does it signify? It turns out interpretation can be context dependent, and context is often invisible to us. Many years ago, I had a girlfriend who was from the north of England. I am from the south of England. I grew up in London. And this is in the era before mobile phones and all that kind of stuff. And she arranged. She said, "Oh, why don't you come round for dinner on Sunday? I've got some friends coming over." I said, "Yeah, okay." So I turned up on Sunday at 6 o'clock. I wondered where her friends were by 6:30. There was a cloud over her. The "I'm not talking to you properly" cloud. "I'm holding myself back" cloud. "I'm probably quite angry with you" cloud. But all I'm going to offer you is silence and a few words. Until I said, "Where are your friends?" "They came 5 hours ago and we ate." Oh, right, Sunday dinner. Dinner for me is an evening meal. Sunday dinner in the north is lunchtime. It might be midday, And we're going to come up to lunch. I realize that my session is the session before lunch. And at 2:30, you will be sitting in here listening to a session. But here's the betrayal. 2:30, what does that mean? Now, a number of you may be listening in Swedish, and you're going, "Oh, it's that." And given that this is Greater Copenhagen, yes, I did say that. A number of you may be looking at it like this. And you're all thinking, "Yeah, 2:30. I have some news for you." That news is that it is not half before, but half after. This is a phrase that is used very much in the UK, in Ireland, in Australia, in New Zealand. It's not common, it's not standard international English. But the signified words do not translate to the same signifier. We can actually hear the same words, translate them and think we're doing a really good job, but actually walk away with a completely different meaning. Yeah, I am talking about software development. But what is also interesting is the subtlety of implied context. For all of your interpretations, I don't think anybody in the room thought that it was going to be this or this. Why am I picking on 2:30 in the afternoon? I never said afternoon, but that's because now you are in the waking part of the day, so you have a context that assumes that I'm not talking about sometime just after midnight. I didn't tell you that. That was nowhere on the slides. That's not even a Swedish or an English thing. That was just to do with where we are now. Of course, I need to offer an appropriate translation. There are a couple of Americans in the audience. If you go to North America and you say something like 2:30, this is what they hear. It's just that. Context. Also, words have more than one meaning. Let's talk about development. Velocity. Oh man, yeah, our team velocity. We actually get to blame Kent, who's not here this year. He was here last year. We get to blame Kent for this idea of development velocity. A lot of people think it's a Scrum idea. No, we get to blame Kent. Velocity. Turns out that velocity has many meanings. The most commonly used meaning that people give it is the idea of speed. Now, it turns out that that's not its formal definition, and as someone with a degree in physics, I feel desperately uncomfortable with this equivalence, because for me, velocity is a vector quantity. It involves direction. And indeed, if teams did talk about their development velocity, I think that would be useful. But most teams don't. They talk about their speed. They are just talking about the absolute value. And that is of surprisingly little interest to us. How fast are you going? Oh man, I am just, I was in Germany last week, and one of the things I love about Germany, when I get a car, is just tearing down the Autobahn. And that's just great. It's just like, yeah, we have no speed limits where we're going. You know, this is great. There I am. I'm shooting along 130 kilometers per hour. And it's just like, yeah, king of the road. And something shoots past me at about 200. It's normally black. I can never tell if it's a Mercedes or BMW, you know, because it's going so fast. And that's the speed. And I remember once driving in Germany at great speed, enjoying that kind of king of the road feeling, and then realizing the sun was in the wrong place. Yeah, you're heading in the wrong direction, Kevlin. It turns out that speed was not important. It turns out direction was important. And honestly, when it comes to software development, are we moving in the right direction is far more important than how fast are we going. So it's a displacement. It's a displacement of position. It's a displacement of position with respect to time. Sometimes we simplify this. We can actually replace S in terms of meaning something like distance. We can use a more technical term. We can talk about it in terms of stuff. That's a more technical term. Velocity or speed is the amount of stuff per time. This gives us a really interesting question. What is the amount of stuff that we are dealing with? And it turns out that a lot of things are implied. So we'll come back to this question because I want to explore this idea of omitting things, that sometimes the thing that means something is not there. This sentence, no verb, is a self-referential sentence. It's autological, and yet the verb looks like this. In other words, the whole context tells you everything. This is an act of compression. The importance of being able to interpret something with respect to a context cannot be underestimated. So I'm going to pick, for example, on the letter K. How do you pronounce the letter K? Well, there's the default one. It's a curse sound. But that's not the end of the story, is it? Because, as I was just reminded of in the previous talk, you Scandinavians do something very strange with it that is totally not K. But then again, Shell also mentioned Alistair Cockburn, where it's completely silent. That also does occur in another word in English, blackguard, which is spelled B-L-A-C-K, G-U-A-R-D. The meaning, the pronunciation, how we are to interpret it is completely surrounded by the context. So we have a silent K. Yes, K can be silent, just as idiot can be silent in President of America. So let's talk about this idea of a thing that is missing. This slide is blank. Now, curiously enough, by putting the word blank on the slide, it's no longer blank. So we have a contradiction. The very act of trying to do something has worked against it. We often get this in code. We're trying so hard to explain something that we actually destroy the meaning. You get this when people start adding suffixes to words. And they say, I'm going to add more parts to the word to make it more meaningful. So I now have an abstract factory controller singleton proxy. And yet, all I'm doing is I'm diluting the meaning with every single addition. By adding, I'm actually removing, which is, wait a minute, this is a contradiction. And then it gets more exciting, because where does the word blank in English come from? It comes from the French, blanc. What does blanc mean? It means white. Apparently, I can have a blank page that is black, or I can have a page that is red. Now, there's nothing on this slide except for red pixels. Red has meaning. Red means danger. Red means stop. Red can also mean celebration. Turns out that the meanings are context dependent, culturally and positionally. It turns out you can subvert meanings with just a few words. It turns out you can remove things. So this is taken in Bristol. Somebody decided, we just change one word and the whole sense of this becomes sinister. You change a symbol, death is coming at any time. You change a symbol, it turns out that our idea of stability is not that stable. That this is important when we deal with composed systems. Software is composed. We like the idea that we just add things. Addition is easy in our minds. And yet, you can take a system that is working in one context and quite easily turn it either into a system that is not working, or a system that has contradictory meaning or works in a different way just by adding something. And the addition actually works against the things that are already there. It's not simply additive. It's not like Lego bricks. So what we're dealing with here is this idea of the signifier. Red can mean stop. We can also have the contrast with green. But this also gives us a different sense of the difficulty of interpretation and understanding that somebody else may not be able to see what you are seeing. Now, I'm going to refer back to Shell's talk before. He used a lot of red and green in his slides. I kept having to ask Nyari, is he using colour on that slide? Because I'm slightly colourblind. So my wife and I went to this installation, this outdoor art installation in Bristol last year. We turned a corner and she chuckled. She said, "Can you read what it says over there?" And I said, "No. I can tell that there's something on the green and it's probably red, isn't it?" And she said, "Yeah." However, I work in technology. I took out my camera and I switched it to black and white. Yes. Yeah, try harder, all right? I've got this one. So you have this. So this is a really interesting point, is I am wired in a way that means I cannot see those things that you want me to see. Now, this is something we may not, sometimes there's the idea that perhaps if we talk to our customer and our colleagues often enough, they'll get the idea. They're probably doing the same to you. It turns out you may not actually have the right disposition to do that. Another one that I have is this one. This is a synesthesia test for number grapheme synesthesia. I have synesthesia, which is kind of interesting given I'm colorblind. I associate colors with numbers. And it turns out it looks like this. I can't really tell much on the right, but I can tell from the left. And the colors are indeed actually wrong for my coding scheme. 2 is actually blue and 5 is red. But there is this idea that I can't make you see the thing that I see. I can't give you the associations that I have with these things. Sometimes the concept of meaning becomes surprisingly private. And are we guarded against that? We have all these other assumptions that are ready to trip us up. In software, we have lots of trees. We have tree structures, folder structures. We have data structures called trees, except all our trees look like this. It's just like, yeah, obviously that's... It's like, what? How did we end up with this? And yet it becomes natural to us. It turns out that we can be using these terms. We don't think of these as green. This is how we think of them. And again, I'm saying something curious there with this concept, red-black trees. So this is an example of the Stroop effect. The ability where something contradicts its own meaning and you are asked to read it out. This is the cover of the original Scrum book. And it's quite interesting trying to get people to read that out, because you just read out the color, not the word. Read out the color. That's a difficult thing, because we have conflicting systems in our head that are giving conflicting interpretations. And we need to be aware of those. Now, one of the things that people often talk about in Scrum is they say, Scrum is, we're focused on value. That's a lovely, absolutely content-free way of saying things. People often say, oh yeah, we need to focus on the thing of value. I have no idea what you're talking about, but the worst thing is if I pretend I have an idea what you're talking about. Value is not a word that has a meaning. What most people are talking about is business value. That can actually be fundamentally different to personal value, okay, and all the other kinds of value. What they're actually saying is we are trying to prioritize by business value, but let me apply one minor correction. People say we're trying to prioritize by business value. We're going to prioritize our requirements by business value. I have some very bad news for you. You cannot prioritize by business value. It is fundamentally against the laws of physics. Whoa, you can see all the certified Scrum Masters in the room going, shit. You can't do it. Why? Because you need time travel. Sure, I can do this. But the rest of you know you can't. You cannot prioritize by business value because you do not know the business value. Stop saying you're prioritizing by business value. You are prioritizing at best by estimated business value. That word estimation is really important. You put that one in there. We think this will be worth something, this much to the organization. But you won't know until you arrive in the future. You have to do the work and do the market and do all the due diligence. You cannot know this stuff. And if you do, what the hell are you doing sitting at a software conference on a Saturday? You should be rich by now. Okay? So we have all these different misinterpretations over the word value. It's a lovely one. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. So I'm going to close by considering just an example of where we can go wrong when we think we're going right, and the fact that meaning is an emergent property of multiple systems. This, a few years back, 2011, the making of a fly, the genetics of animal design, $1.7 million. Now, funnily enough, I spoke to a geneticist recently. I used this example, and they said to me, oh yeah, that is actually a well-known book in genetics, and it is a good book. It's a standard reference book. But honestly, I think I'm going to go for the used price of $35 there. Now, what is interesting here is that we have two. It turns out it's not Amazon. It's not Amazon as a book vendor. This is Amazon as a marketplace. There are two vendors, Profnath and Board eBook. And you'll see that they're both pitching this at around the 2 million mark. It turns out they're the only people in the game. It turns out that if you analyze this more over successive days, something interesting emerges. We end up with constant ratio. It turns out that Profnath has the book. They actually have a copy of the book. And their game, their algorithm, their software, its intention is to undercut the lowest other price in the market. So they will charge just under 100%, 0.998. Board eBook do not have the book. Their goal is you buy the book from them, they buy it from somewhere else, and make a tidy 27% on it, pass it on to you. Both of these systems are independent, and they work. Both of these systems are built on an understanding of meaning, an understanding of this is how the market works. They broke the $20 million barrier before somebody pulled the plug. Now, this has been fixed within Amazon, but this is, if we look at the real world, you may have noticed that those of us in the UK have been running a social experiment for the last couple of years. It's a very large-scale one. I'm not entirely sure we agreed to it. And it's not going very well. And you may have noticed that the pound has a certain amount of volatility, but none more so than on this particular day in October 2016. The pound had already been smashed to the ground, but suddenly in a period of half an hour, it drops by 10%. Now, this is kind of major. It turns out that human beings can't do this. We can't operate this fast. It turns out that exactly what I showed you at Board eBook and Profnath is happening out there in the market. There are individual software systems that have been tested to be correct within their own context, and yet the meaning of what they are doing is not obvious to them, and they are creating this. This is called algorithmic trading. Yeah, if you want to really screw things up at speed, that's what computers are for. So, it's a lovely book about real building architecture. Quote from the Finnish architect, Eliel Saarinen: always design a thing by considering it in its next larger context. This idea is that our meaning is not simply established by looking inside. There is a much bigger thing. When people talk about full stack development, I often notice that they seem to miss out all the lower bits of the stack. Hey, I'm a full stack developer. Oh, okay, so do you develop the device drivers? No. What operating system work and kernel work do you do? No. You're not full stack. I know how far down the stack goes, and it doesn't stop with a bit of JavaScript. Okay. So we need to appreciate that yeah, it is just semantics. Everything is. It's the whole thing. And the very activity of searching for meaning is what we do. It is not the dismissal, it's not the end. We do not stop at the full stop. That is the beginning of what we do. Thank you very much.